Welcome to Colonize the Ocean podcast, where we discuss oceanic colonization, exploration, and education with your hosts Adam Jewell and Brendan Traxler.
Okay, let's unpack this frustrating reality. Have you ever been gripped by an idea, maybe something as bold as universal basic income or a truly free market system, and thought, if we could just try this, it could solve so many problems? But then you immediately run into that wall. Slow, inefficient political systems. It's like trying to innovate in an industry that just won't move.
And that wall you're hitting, it's a fundamental problem, really. A monopoly on governance. Unlike pretty much any other industry, whether it's oil, social media platforms, even railroads, there typically isn't a competitor for your government. You usually have, one option.
Right. One set of rules you have to follow.
Exactly. And you're essentially forced to abide by its rules, pay your taxes, or, face the consequences. When you look at governance as an industry, it is by far the largest in the world. We're talking a massive 30% of global GDP.
Wow, 30%.
Yeah. It affects every single aspect of your life, from the roads you drive on to, the education your children receive. And yet, despite this colossal impact, it's remarkably stagnant. It's often described pretty chillingly as an industry where the poorest performers kill their own customers.
That's a harsh way to put it.
It is. But think about it. We've seen agricultural, commercial, industrial, and information revolutions. Huge leaps forward. But why haven't we had a revolution in governance?
That is the fundamental question, isn't it? For something so deeply entrenched, something that's resisted change for so long. What kind of radical idea could possibly spark a revolution? What does our source material suggest?
Well, our deep dive today points to a rather counterintuitive idea, almost sci-fi sounding, actually. It's the concept of seasteading, building entirely new societies on floating cities out in the open ocean.
Floating cities, okay.
Yeah, the idea is it could offer a completely new frontier for societal experimentation.
Before we dive into floating cities, maybe let's zoom out a bit. Let's talk about why governance and these rules matter so much. You mentioned it affects everything, but how deep does that go?
Oh, incredibly deep. But a decade ago, the World Bank did this exhaustive study. They were trying to pin down what truly makes countries rich and prosperous.
And what did they find? Was it resources, location?
Nope. Neither of those, primarily. Their conclusion was simpler and actually more profound. They said the most valuable thing in the world is the rule of law.
The rule of law.
Yeah, they called it the plant from which everything else sprouts.
Wow, that's a powerful claim. The plant from which everything else sprouts.
It truly is. And to grasp this, just think about North Korea versus South Korea. They share the same peninsula, right? Access to similar natural resources. When they split back in 1948, most people on both sides, they came from the same families, same culture.
Right, shared history.
Exactly. Yet today, almost a century later, look at an image from space at night. South Korea, Japan, China. They gleam with prosperity, lights everywhere. North Korea, though, it's often called a black hole. Rural areas are darker than parts of the ocean. You've got 25 million people living in darkness, facing severe food shortages.
Well, just a few miles south.
Exactly. Just a few miles south, citizens in South Korea are enjoying, all the fruits of a modern, developed society. The difference isn't their geography or their genes, it's the rules.
The rules, how their governments are structured, the laws they enforce.
Precisely. Things like property rights, free enterprise, individual liberties versus arbitrary rule and central control. That's the core difference.
And it's not just Korea, right? Are there other examples like that?
Oh, definitely. If you think that's an isolated case, look at the Dominican Republic versus Haiti. They share the same island, same climate, same potential resources. Yet the border between them is visible from space. Not because of a wall, but because the Dominican side is green, rich with forestry. The Haitian side looks, pretty barren.
Wow, visible from space.
Yeah. Again, the only thing separating them are the artificial lines humans made up and the profoundly different rules that govern each side.
It's incredible how powerful those invisible lines and rules can be.
And this pattern just repeats itself. Think East versus West Germany before reunification, Hong Kong versus mainland China, Singapore versus Malaysia, even Greece versus Albania. In every single one of these cases, the primary distinction, the thing that explains the different outcomes, It comes down to the rules.
So the rules are that critical. They determine prosperity, lifespan, even happiness.
Absolutely. They shape everything.
Yeah.
Economic prosperity, average lifespan, personal happiness, individual liberty. It all flows from the governance structure.
So if the rules are that important, how do we figure out the best rules? How do we innovate in this governance industry? Let's circle back to that monopoly on governance idea you mentioned.
Right. Unlike most markets, where you have competition driving innovation and improvement, governments typically operate without direct competitors. There aren't, two competing U.S. federal governments you can choose between, or multiple German governments.
You're pretty much born into one system, one set of rules, and switching is difficult, very difficult.
Exactly. It's a consequence of how nation-states evolved, fixed borders, national identity, and just the sheer logistical difficulty and cost of moving millions of people or changing deeply entrenched systems. And the implications of this lack of competition, this lack of innovation are, as you said, profound.
You mentioned that quote earlier, the one about the poorest performers kill their own customers. It's pretty stark. What does that actually look like in practice for governments?
Well, it's a rarely literal, direct violence for most citizens in most places, thankfully. But think about preventable famines under autocratic regimes because of terrible agricultural policies. Or think about the lack of basic health care and education in deeply corrupt states. That leads to vastly shortened lifespans, limited opportunities. That's a kind of killing, isn't it?
A killing of potential, yeah.
Right. Or the suppression of free expression, arbitrary seizures of property, economic policies that just stifle innovation and trap whole populations in poverty. These are all ways that a non-innovative, unchecked governance system can effectively diminish or even end the lives and potential of its customers, its citizens, through neglect, inefficiency, or deliberate oppression.
So it's a powerful way to frame the human cost of stagnant governance.
Exactly. It highlights why we've had all these other revolutions, agricultural, industrial, innovation, but this vital governance industry seems stuck in a time warp almost.
So if land-based governance is largely this monopoly and change is so hard, what if we just move? This brings us back to seasteading.
Right. The idea of citizens living in, say, modular pods or interconnected platforms out on the sea, specifically in international waters.
International waters. Okay, so outside existing national control.
Precisely. What's fascinating here is its core promise to fundamentally change that monopolistic dynamic. Governments on these floating cities would essentially be forced to compete for citizens, just like companies compete for customers in a free market.
Ah, so if a city's rules are bad or inefficient,
its customers, the citizens, could simply pack up and leave.
Right.
Float their home to a different city-state, perhaps. It flips the script entirely. It puts the power back with the individual.
And that's the key benefit then, right? And instead of being stuck, you can vote with your feet, or I guess vote with your rudder. If you don't like the laws of Floating City Alpha, you can relatively easily leave and join Floating City Beta.
Exactly. This allows for real-life testing of political and social ideas. Not just endless debates in academic journals or political campaigns, but actual trials. It creates what some call a Silicon Valley of governance.
A Silicon Valley of governance. I like that. Where ideas get tried out, iterated on, refined based on actual results. There's that quote, arguments don't change the world, startups change the world. This sounds like applying that startup mentality to society itself.
That's a great way to put it. Plus, there's the practical advantage of mobility you mentioned. If a major hurricane is coming, unlike Miami or New Orleans, a floating city could potentially move out of harm's way.
That's a huge advantage.
It is. It's like the city's physical structure is the hardware of society, and the rules, the laws chosen by its citizens. That's the software. You can upgrade or change the software much more easily when the hardware isn't permanently bolted to the ground.
That's a fascinating metaphor. Hardware and software for society. Okay, a Silicon Valley of governance on the ocean. It's definitely radical.
Yeah.
But is it feasible? Is the tech actually there, or is it still firmly in the realm of science fiction?
Actually, it's much closer than you might think. This isn't pure sci-fi. The source gives some really concrete examples of large structures already thriving on the sea. Think about massive cruise ships. They're basically floating towns.
Yeah, true.
Or Japan. They have numerous giant airport islands built out in the water. We have huge container ships crisscrossing the globe constantly. And then there's Shell's floating natural gas facility, the Prelude FLNG. It's actually longer than the Empire State Building is tall.
Longer than the Empire State Building. Wow. Floating.
Floating. And don't forget nuclear submarines and nuclear aircraft carriers. Those things can stay at sea for 15, even 20 years before needing to refuel. So almost all the technology needed for seasteading already exists. It's really just a matter of combining these proven elements in new, innovative ways.
So the basic structure isn't some unknown future tech. It's conceptually simpler, like interchangeable floating modules, connected together. Modules for living, working, playing, all on the ocean. And maybe canals instead of roads, like Venice or Miami, but floating.
Exactly like that. It sounds a bit like an aquatic Lego set. And in some ways, it is. The floating platforms themselves. They can be built from materials we already use extensively in marine environments. Steel, concrete, maybe advanced fiber composites like carbon fiber.
Pros and cons to each, I assume.
Oh yeah, longevity, cost, weight, maintenance. But the key physics principle is that bigger platforms are more stable against waves. So there's a natural incentive to build larger ocean cities for comfort and stability. And once you have these stable platforms, you can build pretty much anything on top. Housing, offices, hotels, parks, green spaces, ports, even power generators, like floating solar farms or maybe something like that massive shell gas facility.
You know, hearing about that shell facility longer than the Empire State Building, that really shifts the perspective. It makes floating cities sound less like a pipe dream and more like, well, an engineering challenge, but a solvable one.
Exactly. And if we're looking for a perfect existing example, you really don't have to look further than those cruise ships we mentioned.
Right. They have more amenities than the average small town. Shops, theaters, restaurants, pools, plus their own medical staff, their own security. They're self-contained communities.
And the economics are surprisingly interesting. If you look at, say, an 18-night European cruise, an inside cabin might cost around $66 a day. That works out to about $2,000 a month.
$2,000 a month while traveling Europe.
Right. Or maybe $100 a night for a cabin with a view, so $3,000 a month. Even that higher price is still like half the cost of the average apartment in Manhattan.
That's actually pretty compelling financially.
It is. And it's not just for short vacations. The source talks about people who live on cruise ships full time. There's Mama Lee, who's been cruising for over a decade. Apparently her husband's last words were, "Never stop cruising."
Wow, she took him seriously.
Seems like it, and loves it. And there's another guy, Mario Saucedo, who's taken over 2,000 cruises in the last 20 years. People are already choosing this ocean-based lifestyle.
People are already living semi-permanently at sea.
And this connects directly back to the governance idea. Cruise ships are already masters at playing the jurisdiction game. They operate in international waters much of the time, and they register their ships in countries like Panama, Liberia, or the Marshall Islands, specifically to benefit from less regulation and lower taxes.
Ah, so they're already choosing their rules in a way.
Exactly. They're kind of ahead of the game because they already get to pick and choose which governments they want to work with, which regulations they operate under. It's a fascinating precursor to the seasteading model. It proves that choosing governance by moving your platform is already happening. And remember, people once thought giant cruise ships were impossible too. Skepticism isn't new here.
That's a really good point. Okay, so we've established rules are crucial, existing governance is slow to change, and floating cities aren't sci-fi tech. How do we actually change rules and find better ones, historically and potentially now?
Well, historically, big shifts often happen through colonizing new land, right? Think about the American experiment.
Yeah, that was seen as a totally crazy idea back then. Power with the people, not a monarch. Radical stuff.
Totally radical. But it eventually became, arguably, the industry standard for governance around the world, influencing constitutions everywhere. The problem now, though, is there aren't really any empty continents left to discover and experiment on, at least not without conflict.
Right. No more new worlds on Earth.
So given those limits on land, one approach that's had incredible success more recently is the Special Economic Zone, or SEZ.
SEZs, right, like specific areas within a country with different rules.
Exactly. Usually more market-friendly rules, lower taxes, less regulation designed to attract investment and kickstart rapid growth. The classic story really starts with Hong Kong. After World War II, it was under British rule. When it was eventually handed back to China in 1997, the difference in rules was stark. The British system in Hong Kong, lower taxes, strong property rights, less central planning compared to mainland China's communist system, caused Hong Kong's wealth to just explode.
How much?
Over 36 years, the average person's wealth in Hong Kong grew by 87 times. 87.
Wow. That's staggering growth.
It was. China was so impressed, they decided to copy the model, creating their own SEZs along the coast, and similar transformations happened there.
Like Shenzhen. Right, I read about that. Went from basically a fishing village.
Exactly. Shenzhen had no traffic lights in 1979, 25 years later. It's the hardware capital of the world, a futuristic megacity. Today, something like 90% of all computer keyboards and mice are made there.
Incredible, and the impact on poverty.
Huge. It's estimated that at least 500 million people escaped extreme poverty, largely by migrating to work in China's SEZs. It just shows the raw power of changing the rules in even a small area.
Are there other models besides that low-tax, high-growth one?
Oh yes. Singapore is another powerhouse SEZ example. Very few natural resources, but incredibly successful. They have universal health care, the government makes more money than it spends, and while it uses English common law, it also has very strict rules, like mandatory death sentences for possessing just over half an ounce of heroin.
Wow. Strict, but successful.
Very. Went from widespread illiteracy to one of Asia's richest countries. But then you have a completely different model like the Nordic countries, Sweden, Denmark, Norway. They're also kind of like SEZs in their uniqueness, but they go the other way. High personal taxes, very generous welfare services, strong unions. People there work some of the fewest hours globally.
And yet they're always ranked among the happiest populations, right?
Consistently. So this shows there isn't just one single correct set of rules. Different approaches, different software can lead to different kinds of success and societal well-being.
So, okay. If you have Singapore's strict low-tax success story and the Nordic high-tax, high-welfare, high-happiness model, what's the answer? Which is better, more welfare or less government?
This raises an important question. The honest answer is we don't definitively know because we simply haven't run enough experiments. Think about Thomas Edison again. He famously said it took him, 10,000 attempts to get the light bulb right?
Right, 10,000 tries for a light bulb.
So if it takes that many tries for a relatively simple device, how can we possibly expect to find the optimal way to organize millions of complex human beings, each with their own goals and problems, after only, say, 700 tries? Because that's roughly what we have now. But 195 countries, plus maybe 500-ish SEZs. Around 700 experiments total globally throughout history.
That's not a lot of experiments for such a complex problem.
Not at all. At this rate, we might never discover the truly miraculous ways societies could function. We need, as the course suggests, thousands of startup societies, places where people can voluntarily join and leave, fostering a kind of evolutionary market process for governance, where solutions can emerge that we can't even conceive of right now.
Okay, but what about the problems with just creating more SEZs on land? You mentioned limitations earlier.
Exactly. There are big hurdles. First, as we said, there's no truly new unclaimed land to colonize peacefully for these experiments. You have to carve it out of an existing nation. Second, doing that requires existing global powers to voluntarily give up sovereign control over a piece of their territory. Understandably, they're often very reluctant to do that quickly or widely. And third, most successful SEZs benefit hugely from being in prime coastal locations with good access to trade. That's a finite resource.
So land-based experiments are limited by geography and politics.
Precisely. And this is exactly where seasteading comes back in as a potential solution to those specific limitations. Floating cities are mobile. They aren't tied to one nation's coast. They can position themselves in the most economically advantageous spots in international waters, near trade routes, wherever makes sense.
So they bypass the need for land and existing government permission, mostly.
Right. They could allow for far more of these governance experiments, the kind that made Hong Kong or Shenzhen prosper to happen without needing to beg for land from existing powers or trying to overhaul deeply entrenched national systems.
And you mentioned the risk factor is lower, too.
Yeah, significantly lower, theoretically.
Right.
If a seastead government turns out to be ineffective or corrupt, it wouldn't necessarily lead to the kind of mass suffering, war, or starvation we sometimes see in failing states on land. Why? Because citizens could, in theory, just leave relatively easily, take their homes, their businesses, their skills, and join a different floating community. It's a lower-stakes laboratory.
A laboratory for societal innovation with an exit strategy built in.
Exactly. So, look, seasteading isn't being presented as the single magic bullet answer to all complex societal problems or some guaranteed utopia. That would be naive. But by leveraging existing technology and utilizing international waters, it does seem to represent, perhaps, the path of least resistance right now, the most practical way to enable vastly more experimentation in how we govern ourselves.
At least until, maybe, major powers become much more willing to cede land for experiments, or perhaps until space colonization becomes truly viable and affordable.
Precisely. It offers a way forward now, using tools we largely already have.
What a deep dive this has been. We've gone from the frustration of slow political change to the fundamental power of rules, seen examples from Korea to Singapore, and explored this radical yet maybe practical idea of floating cities. It really drives home that the structures we live under, the rules, are maybe the most powerful levers we have for prosperity and human flourishing. And seasteading. It offers this potential new frontier, a way to actually experiment with those levers.
It definitely challenges us to think differently about how societies evolve, not just through debate, but through actual creation and choice.
It really does.
And maybe that leaves us with a final provocative thought for you, the listener, to mull over.
Yeah.
If you could truly choose the rules for your society, simply by choosing where you lived, maybe on one of these future floating platforms, what kind of society would you build? What rules would you choose?